Now, before inviting Marina and Naeem for the conversation portion of tonight, we are showing two clips that are representative of Marina's practice. The Baitur Roof Mosque in Dhaka, for which she won the 2016 Aga Khan Award for Architecture, and Kudibari, modular and mobile housing for refugees that Naeem mentioned just a moment ago.
The buildings, for me, are living beings. They breathe, they have a soul of their own, and they age.
The Baitur Roof Mosque in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, is unlike any other. It's the work of architect Marina Tabassum.
I tried to get rid of the symbolic elements in a mosque is because I wanted to, so that this is not only used as a space for prayer, but also for other activities, social, communal activities, that it can encourage that to happen. The fact that it doesn't look like a mosque initially was a barrier. Where's the dome? Where's the minaret? And then, of course, we had to go through the process of telling them that, you know, you don't need a minaret or a dome to make it a mosque. This is the prayer hall. This is the main space of the whole mosque. As you can see, this space was perceived as a pavilion. It is on 8 columns on 8 sides and then converges. So this is where you can see the entrance court. You see the light and the breeze coming in through those walls. It's all naturally ventilated, perforated brickwork, and interestingly, this whole brickwork is load-bearing.
I think this is an unique architecture because in Bangladesh you hardly find environmental friendly mosque. You see the lights, the air circulations, the layout of the mosque.
I've always been very interested in spirituality as an element in architecture. So you have to enter into a mosque, leave behind your daily worries and and stresses. So it's a kind of a labyrinth that you enter through, and as you walk along into the prayer hall, you leave behind all those things and you sort of try to concentrate. So the space is designed in a way that it does that.
It's certainly unusual to find a woman architect both designing and constructing a mosque.
First and foremost, I don't see myself as a woman in that sense when I'm doing my projects. I'm an architect, and that whole persona as a female somehow vanishes when I'm into my work. When does he come?
Thank you for joining us and indulging.
Well, thank you for having me. That was great, Naeem. I didn't expect you to come up with this wonderful, this. We had so much of technical glitches while he was there. We had electricity cutting off and then the battery and all kinds of things.
And the camera overheating.
Oh, yeah, the camera. And then your photographer, well, the cameraman never showed up, right? He got sick and all that, so. That was quite nice, wasn't it? A big clap for Naeem.
And to Mia Artola, my very patient editor. I had you were traveling, you were in transit, and I messaged Jessie from the office, and she sent me the videos, which I had seen before, but I didn't have a link. And I remember, both of these videos and a third one, they're so beautiful that I felt relieved because we were in a fairly dark place with the videos and getting darker, and then when we saw these videos, I said, okay, it's okay because these will come afterwards, so we won't besmirch your, or people will have a way to see your architecture without having to depend on our videos. And I suppose the one thing right away that struck me through this process is, I mentioned in the beginning that I thought the Diller Scofidio must have had a project about architecture, which it turns out they didn't, at least not in this iteration. And then we had this idea that we were somehow going to capture what architecture looks like through time lapse, which I also noticed is used in your Baitu Roof video, actually, but nicer effect, the light goes across the floor. But then what we found out through, it was supposed to be one day and then became week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, then we had to come back because we're still trying to get the perfect day. But I suppose in the process we found out that not much of what the layman would understand as the making of is physically happening in the office. I remember you said at some point, people will get the impression that all we do is sit around computers.
Yeah, well, architecture is a process, right? It involves a lot of process. A good thing that you're not an architect. I think the fact that did you flunk in the admission test? You did, okay, all right. But, I think...
I got 0 on the drawing question, as my cousin pointed out. Yeah.
But, you went your own way, which is great. Well, in terms of architects, we do have different process. Every project has a different way of addressing it. So some of the projects, like the ones we work in Rohingya refugee camp, or the climate response projects that we're doing with Kudibari. These projects require us to be on site more than being in the computer or on the design board. The design is already there, but more than the architectural design, it's more about engagement with people, going to site. The complexity is somewhere else. It's not in the process of design on the drawing board. So quite often when we are doing in these projects, we are hardly there in the office. We are on site and engaging with the community, engaging in hands-on building and construction. So the entire architects team that we have, they're all very hands-on. They work with their own hand. And it's a new generation of architects, I would say, that are not just bounded in office and drawing or computer, but they're also highly skilled builders, and not just builders, but also good cooks. They have to be good cooks. That's one of our criteria when we bring them in. Yeah.
I think we also had this thing where I had this idea that we shouldn't give away anything confidential. So although the camera's 360 is taking in everything, we're careful never to show the computer screen. So there's a long shot of Jessie where it just looks like it's not clear what she's doing, but but of course she's working on our computer. So also the ballet of the work in front of the computer, the way it's captured, is a lot of people looking at things. I sort of had a sequence of questions I wanted to ask, but I'm going to jump to something right away, which is your most well-known project, which is the Baitur Rauf, at least well-known to a global architecture community because it won the Aga Khan Award and then certain things. But the video that the Aga Khan Foundation made, you're naturally asked about being a woman designing a mosque. And then you answer in an unexpected, there are other ways, but you answer in an unexpected way, which is that you said that, you didn't say you stopped being a woman, but you said that all disappeared. I'm just an architect. And there are other ways, of course, to answer that question as well. But I'm just wondering, because that was then, and then as you mentioned earlier, you've received many invitations to make mosques, and you haven't necessarily accepted it. But I'm just thinking how you're navigating this, especially because for people who don't know the context, within the Bangladesh context, there's a sort of U-turn that's happened vis-a-vis religion, because Bangladesh, well, first of all, East Bengal becoming part of Pakistan after 47 is a direct result of wanting a Muslim homeland, and then Bangladesh splitting off from Pakistan is a result of a rejection of the Muslim homeland, and throughout the 70s and 80s, secularism was the default mode of a certain kind of modernism, right? And there's a U-turn of some kind that's been going on for 20 years, and you're somewhere in the middle or intersecting or not part of it, parallel. It's a big question, but just like to ask you, the mosque and spirituality, but also spirituality is a way to speak about it where that's a little way, I would say even safe to talk about in certain contexts. People think spirituality, they don't think of other aspects of, what's the role of the mosque vis-a-vis the Muslim world and its role as we face it as a bearer of progress or not?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that, that answer, I was young, but that was 2015 or 16, I think. But the thing is, what I was trying to say, or, however it came out, I don't know. The idea is that, my being whatever gender I am has nothing to do with me being a professional. To some extent, when I address a project, I address it as an architect. And an architect, despite being whatever gender they're from, should have the ability to address a project, be it a parliament building. Nobody would ask Khan the question that you've never built a parliament. How did you, being a man, design a parliament? Why does that question come to me? Because I am addressing a project as an architect. And as an architect, I should be able to address mosque as I could address a church or a temple or a parliament, or it could be anything. So that's where I was coming from, actually, when I was answering that question. And going back to you, this whole issue of mosque, and yes, I have been asked several times to design many mosques. I was very selective about addressing most of these projects. Quite often, I did was offered a mosque in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, large mosques, very prestigious. But where I came from with this mosque design, when I addressed it, it was in 2005. And as you know, my grandmother was the one who commissioned me for this project. The thing is, it was a different world at that time. 9/11 had happened. There were two wars, the Afghanistan and Iraq. And Islam and Muslim, the identity of Muslim was being questioned in many ways. So that's a point where I started the designing. And I think at that point in time, my main question that I was constantly asking was, what is it that's important when you design a mosque at a time like this? Is it symbols? Do you address the symbols? Is the dome and the minaret the ultimate symbol of Islam? Or is it about the spirituality, the values the religion is trying to bring about? So basically, that's the reason why I decided in a way to forego the whole idea of symbolism and the identity associated with symbols, and to focus more on the idea of spirituality, and also, in a way, the things that Islam generally talks about: brotherhood, being equal as human, not having any hierarchy. So the space, as you can see, has light all around it, so that when someone is standing in prayer, nobody feels being left out or behind or front. So there is this whole, and I think the circular volume also adds to that it's kind of centralizes it. And of course, so basically that was one of the issues I think were important. In terms of the secularity and this whole notion of now what's happening, I think, when we became Pakistan after the partition, the fact that we were very much looking for this identity, I think at least the Pakistani idea was that this whole idea of being this new Islamic country, and I think if you remember Louis Khan's parliament building, which was at that time second capital, when he was designing it, or even before that, I think when he was asked to design the presidential palace in Islamabad, and his design was rejected because it was not Islamic enough. So he didn't want to lose this commission, and for that reason, he kind of came up with the idea.
Less Islamic capital.
Yeah. So no, the fact is he decided that if he would have to have this commission, then the mosque needs to play an important role. So that's why in our main parliament building, you'll see that that was kind of a eureka moment for him, that people should enter under the mosque. So the entire volume, the way the plan is done, the mosque basically shifts. And creates that interesting moment where you can see that he actually addressed this whole issue of Islam being a fundamentally important identity for Pakistan. But then later on, I think when Bangladesh came about, I think we were more looking towards a secular identity. And then more and more nowadays, things are being polarized, as we have seen everywhere in the world, I think.
Louis Khan's also an interesting example because he doesn't actually finish the building. He dies before the building is finished. And then it's finished in Bangladesh 10 years later under a military government. So there's also that whole linkage with who finished it. He doesn't live to see it finished.
No, he didn't. No, he passed in 1974. The building was finished in 1981, I think.
And you designed... this comes back to a collaboration we had once talked about. You designed as part of Arbana with Kashif, the Liberation War Monument Museum, whose opening was delayed because, if I'm remembering the details correctly, the government changed, and the new government wasn't so keen on the project. So you've also navigated this much earlier scenario. This is in the 1990s.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that's the Museum of Independence and the Monument of Independence of Bangladesh. And we won that in a competition very early in our career. That was in 1997. I think we were 28 years of age at that time, so that was quite an enormous responsibility at such a young age. But I think we took it quite seriously. But what happened is, and we really didn't do any other project except for that one. We were completely engrossed in bringing out something which would be lasting there for hundreds of years, because it's representing the country, the history, and everything. It was the Awami League government who initiated the project because of their role in the war and in the birth of Bangladesh. And then after that, I think when Awami League was
out of
power, and then BNP came in, the project was under lock and key. There was a lot of investigation of corruption and all of that. So it was under lock and key for quite some time. And they tried to change the project. They tried to change the monument that we designed, tried to reduce the project, the budget, and all of that. So we went through a lot of crisis at that point. And then later on, when Awami League again came to power, and it was their election mandate that they want to finish the project. So finally, it was finished after 16 years. So by that time, yeah.
Louis Khan, there's a famous story about Louis Khan that he's working on the parliament building, and it's still Pakistan, and then riots break out on the streets, and of course his team is Bengali, and there's a sentiment that we need to stop because the whole country is coming to a stop, and he supposedly said to Mazharul Islam or somebody else, no, we're going to continue because when all this is over, if it's a new country, they'll still need a parliament. So it's also, without critiquing him per se at this point, what would be the point also, but Louis Khan had this idea of architects existing above politics, which I don't believe in, of course, and you've seen that you can't actually exist outside of politics, for example, with that
No,
project.
I mean, your time is your context. I think as much as the site, the physical existence of a site and people who you design for, that's a context, but time itself is a part of the context. So you cannot ignore the need of the time, be it political, cultural, or however it comes. Yeah.
I have one more question, and then I actually want to turn over to the audience for their questions for you.
Why me? It's your project.
Or about this process, which is that the Khudibari project and the Sharjah Biennial project you did was also around this idea of mobility. I just wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because you had said at a seminar I had listened to where that it's an adaptation of a situation where the soil keeps disappearing, your address disappears, so you have to move. I'm also wondering, though, how that intersects with the state's responsibility, because in some ways, if people are building their own homes and moving with it, the state doesn't seem to have a role. I just wonder if that also comes into your thinking.
Right. Well, the Khudibari project came out of this Sharjah Architecture Triennial. It was a commissioned research by the Triennial, where we were asked to look into this land erosion that we have. The Bengal Delta is has a unique phenomena where it's constantly eroding and new land emerges. So it's sort of a interplay of erosion and emergence that's constantly happening, and which has caused a lot of people to lose their houses and livelihood and everything. Many of the small towns and villages has also disappeared with this flow of water, and that is escalating with the change of the climate, the unpredictability of the glacial water that's coming down from the Himalayas and the rain and all of that. So it's escalating. Even the flooding is becoming much more prominent. And we see that in our coastal areas. The biodiversity is changing, the ecology is changing. So while we were doing this research, and this research was actually for a very different reason, it was looking into the rights of future generation. That's what we were focusing on. So we were focusing on inheritance in many ways. But I think it was also the issue where we went into these sand beds and we saw people living there with absolute minimum means. There was no house or nothing. So during the COVID time, when office was more or less had no work, at that point all the projects were stopped. So this is the time when we came out with this idea that can we do something about this climate issue, and we can create a structure which people can then take with them. So the house is almost like a furniture. Like when you move your house, you take all your furniture. So in this case, you take your house with you. And these lands do not belong to them. So these are just sand beds where they are living for a certain years, and then when they have to move, they just have to move. So in this case, they can move with the house. And the house is designed in a way that it can be dismantled very quickly. And if you don't want to take all the bamboo and structure, you can only take the steel connectors, which actually connects the bamboos and creates the structure, which is very simple. The house that you just saw in Ukia, where we live when we work in the refugee camps, it's the same kind of a structure, but it was a much more grander with bamboo and all that. In case our Kudibari, it's a little bit less so. But yeah, that's how it came about. And I think it's a response to the climate crisis. It's a response, as you know, the government doesn't have any planning as such how this climate adaptation should be done. There's a lot of concern, but there's no resolution or any kind of action in that sense. And you cannot just wait for government to do something. That's what I feel. You have to, if you have the ability and the knowledge and the means, to some extent, you should be able to go about and make the change. And that's what I'm trying to practice now as an architect, that how architects can become the agent of change. And where there is no project, you can actually create a project, like in this case, the climate crisis, and then you can make an idea and then take it to people where people are ready to actually finance some of these projects. So we got a grant with which we are now building 100 houses in different locations. It's a kind of a research also to see how you can make an intervention into the vernacular. So making intervention into the vernacular is one of the most toughest thing you can ever do. And that's very slow a process. It's also a process which engages with people. You have to have conversation. You have to be able to understand their need, respect their need, and then to very slowly and respectfully give them the idea so that it finally comes to a point where they accept it.
I very much like the idea of the fact that they don't have to own the property, the land on which they settle their houses. That partially answers the question about what's the role of the state. Maybe the role of the state is just to get out of the way. Yes, Matilde is indicating to us. So the evening was in two different meters, of course, the first half and the second half. And so we'd love to hear from the audience. Doesn't have to be questions, actually. It would be great to hear some thoughts, your own experiences.
So thanks. This was a very nice presentation. I actually have a question about the mosque, because I thought it's very beautiful and very unique in the way that it's designed. But I'm very curious to know about the people, like the locals that actually maybe used the mosque. What was their what was their impression? How were they? What did they think about it? I think it's a beautiful statement and it's a beautiful design, and I'm very proud to even see a mosque that's designed in this way. But I think architecture, part of its role is to inspire people to live differently, to think differently. So all of these things that you mentioned, like the circular structure, the equality, the environmental sustainability, did you find that it somehow inspired people to think differently about their religion and the way they practice their religion?
That's quite difficult to address, The fact is, it cannot be done in a day, maybe over a period of time. The religion is... One mosque cannot change that. But you can just make attempts to change the mindset of people. So that's what I'm kind of trying to do, perhaps. In terms of this mosque, when we were designing, I had to involve people, also the community. Not in the design process, but it's more when we were looking for funding. My grandmother donated the land, and then she also gave me some money to initiate the project, but then she passed, and then after that it became my responsibility to raise the fund and everything. So the local community, since there was no other mosque in that area, were actually able to raise funding And so, so there was a lot of conversation. There was a lot of excitement about having a mosque. And so when we were working, of course, there was this aspiration for a minaret, not dome, but minaret. But then we also had to have those conversations that do you really need a minaret? The building which is right behind it acts as a minaret because we have our the sound system is right above on that thing, and it really goes out to people. And how high do you want your minaret? All the buildings around it is about 12-story, 8-story. So at the end, it really would not make much of a sense. So why would we invest that amount of money to just build a minaret, which nobody will be able to see? So there had to be rationalizing to make them understand why it's not such an important need, as opposed to when it was a need because there was no other way of reaching out to people with the call for prayer, and you had to raise high above a level so that sound can reach people, which is not the case anymore. So those are the issues we had to deal with. But in terms of changing people's perception, ideas, it will take time. I think that's how it is. I've been asked several times I was in fact asked a question day before yesterday when I was giving a talk in Toronto, and there was this one boy asked that your mosque doesn't have any space for women to pray, and you're a woman who designed a mosque, the client is a woman, so how do you address that? Which is a good question. And so my answer was, again, another question, that I have a proposition that I want to pray in that same space as men do. Why am I not allowed to stand behind the imam and do the prayer? So if men are not interested in having women in the same space when we are praying, that we have to be behind somewhere, why don't we have two congregations, one men's and one women? And then we solve the problem of having anybody to sacrifice, one being behind the other. So, it could be two congregations. But that's an idea I think can very well be valid and can work. But can I propose it now? I don't think so. But, but it takes time, but hopefully someday,
I had a question about the performance that we saw tonight. I just was struck by the difference in the two videos and the narration accompanying. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about your political thoughts, because one was so banal. I mean, the refresh was describing the most basic of humans looking into a camera, brushing their hair, and was elevated, I think, by the narration and the words. And ritualized in a very interesting way. But then the insights into the office, your office, I thought were remarkable but very different, where you discuss the connections to colonial history and the beautiful work with regard to the Rohingya. So while what we were watching was almost routine, what was said was far deeper in my view. And I was just curious how you see in the performance what your intentions were bringing all that together.
Thank you. It started out, as I mentioned, by me misunderstanding what the Diller Scofidio project was, because there was no documentation at the time. I'd already gone to Bangladesh and filmed with this idea of telescoping 365 days down to one and 12 sites into one office only. And then later on, Sarah Tucker rebuilt it so that I was able to see it after the footage is done. And then what you start seeing gradually, if you look at the full body of Refresh, all the text is quite dark. I read excerpts, but in full there's like thwarted romance, people spying on each other, perhaps an employee who, to use James Scott's phrase, weapons of the week, doesn't really want to work there, so spends all their time basically foot dragging. They're like little islands of resistance in their little cubicles. that, and that person who's also the main image from the project is the perfect example, who initially wants to participate and then eventually says, I'm going to jam Big Brother in the way he can, with his notepad. So once I started actually looking through it, there's quite strange bits, and I haven't had the chance to talk to Diller Scofidio, so I don't know what was going through their head, and there's not any other documentation about it. So I was really struck by that, and of course the obvious contrast is that office setup is like very Peyton Place, if you know that novel. Like, it's superficially very calm, but underneath is roiling trouble. So I was drawn to that aspect. I'm usually drawn to what's underneath. So for example, in Marina's office, the person who naturally I bonded with was Sharif, because he's always the one who'd let us in, and who, after the first couple of days, Marina was off and out, and the other staff after a while just got kind of uninterested in the camera. It's also up on very high, so you can very easily forget about it. So it became uninteresting also because nothing was really happening, right? Except it would turn off. And then they would call me and say, hey, your camera's turned off again. But Sharif was really interested in what we were doing and kept asking. So I usually become interested in those kinds of, I can sort of think of the inner life of Sharif, By the way, I noticed that in the Baitul Rauf mosque video, he's there going to prayers also. I suddenly was like, oh, here's my movie star in that thing. So I'm drawn to those kinds of people, and I start, I originally had this idea to interview people in the office, and then I put that idea aside, and I decided, no, I'm going to make my own speculative script for what's going on. So there are fragments of actual events and fragments of fiction all rolled in. And then that story is really true. I really did fail the exam, and obviously I don't remember any of the names except the person who stood first, because that's where you get when you realize, oh, I'm really not in this list, because that's actually the end. So that story was really stuck in my head, and I thought it was kind of an interesting way to start. So that's what it went. And then as Mia and I found out, even though this is the newest camera, we use both an Insta360 and a GoPro 360. When my first camera person kind of got sick and disappeared. And supposedly it's all really high quality footage, but it's really high quality footage for one kind of purpose only, which is to make these adventure videos that are very popular in skateboarding world and surfing world. If you're trying to do something else, and if you're working with a situation where nothing's happening, where nobody's really moving except moving their hands up and down, then I think suddenly glitches start appearing. And we sort of Mia and I both became very obsessed by the glitches and wanted to push them further. And, of course, the electricity keeps going. And then just organically this process happened of, this film Prestige, which is really creepy and weird, popped into my head. And I said, well, what happened to that wireless electricity dream, which just, it went into directions that naturally suggested itself, yeah. And like I said, we went to a pretty dark place about 2 days ago, which is why thank God, we saw these other two. Because there was also this sort of feeling, okay, we can do whatever. We can be free. And then there was this feeling, but wait, it's Marina Tabassum's office. We also have to represent their work somehow. And then when we saw these videos, we were like, no, we actually don't have to, because these videos exist. So anyone who really wants to understand the architecture practice isn't going to try to understand it from this video. They'll be able to go somewhere else.
Thank you again for your performance and your work. I'm going back to the mosque that you built, and it was interesting to see that you actually raised the minaret, which is a kind of a reference to the primitive mosque of the Prophet. And many dynasties and religious groups in Islam throughout centuries actually made this choice of erasing the minaret as a reference against to the Prophet's mosque. So I was wondering, because in a mosque, what is the most symbolic part in a mosque is the mihrab, the prayer niche. What did you do with the mihrab and the qibla wall in that mosque?
Right. Well, going back to the Prophet's mosque, if you have, I started the entire research starting from the Prophet's mosque, actually, how it came into being and what was the genesis of that mosque form. And it's actually the house form that was taken And also the material was, of course, the date palm tree as the roof material. And then since it was an oasis, so it was mostly wall made out of mud and all that. So basically the idea was taking a house form, enlarging it to make space for congregation. And so that was it. So a congregation, space for congregation. So a collective, a space for collective, a space where people could gather, not only for prayer, but also for other activities like social, communal, administrative, diplomatic, judicially. So there are lots of issues that were tackled in mosque earlier, during the Prophet's time. The thing is, if you go to the absolute essence of what is a mosque, you need a space for congregation, if it's a congregatory mosque. You need the direction, as you said, which is the direction of Qibla, an imam to be there and to do your ablution for a congregation mosque. And if it's just a prayer, anywhere on earth is your mosque. So you don't need anything for that reason. So basically, those are the few essential points that I had in mind, and the rest of it that you see are liturgical elements that were later on added to mosque through the various points in time. So if you look at the mosque that we have designed, it's basically a space of congregation. The mihrab doesn't really exist in that sense. It's that the imam will stand in the front, but the qibla is donated with a slit of light that comes through that space. So basically, the qibla is the only connection. There is no wall actually. It's a connection in a way which brings in light and also gives you a kind of a connectivity with the outside world, which again directs you towards Mecca in a very abstract way. So I would say that all the elements are present, but in a very abstract way. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because the mihrab is actually the sign of the presence and the absence of the Prophet and his light. And usually there is a lamp hanging in the mihrab to materialize this light. So that
is liturgical, as I said.
Yeah,
it was
so
added.
It was added.
So I kind of decided to kind of forego all of that and keep the essence of it.
That's fascinating.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all for coming, and thank you, Naeem, and thank you, Marina.